Good evening, everyone. How's it going? Hope you're all doing well. I'm here with a question for you. Have you ever wondered where this comes from? Here we are tonight, attempting to answer that very question. Is the answer definitive? I'll start out by saying maybe not, but maybe I'll make a compelling enough argument to make you wonder and think just how that opening riff of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue is related to our very own Charleston. Does it have Charleston roots? Is there another composer and piece that is directly responsible for that opening, very, very distinct, recognizable riff? In fact, did you know that Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, the opening, was voted the second most recognizable opening to any classical piece of music, like ever, behind Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? I think we all know what that one is, but let's dive right in, shall we? Because there's so much fun things to talk about tonight. And tonight's presentation is called An American Rhapsody, a tale of two composers, two pieces, and one city. I've already mentioned one of the composers and one of the pieces, and the city I've already mentioned is Charleston. We'll see what role Charleston has to play in the creation of Rhapsody in Blue. For now, though, let's identify that other piece and that other composer. The other composer in question is Charleston's own Edmund Thornton Jenkins. Now, I put their timelines here because I want you to look at how very similar these two composers' timelines are. Gershwin was born in 1898 in New York and died in 1937. And Edmund Thornton Jenkins was born here in Charleston in 1894 and died in 1926 in Paris. Both lived lives that were way too short, and we were robbed of two amazing careers that could have perhaps even more broadly expanded our idea of what American symphonic music is. Too bad for us. However, we are lucky enough to know that they gave us enough nuggets of gold and wisdom that we can still enjoy today. So, we've now identified the two gentlemen in question here. One a Charleston native, love it. And here's a quote by Antonin Dvorak, okay? He says, "I'm convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." Now, I just mentioned that Gershwin and Jenkins were born in the late 1890s. This quote from Dvorak is from the early 1890s, right around the time when American music was beginning to get its foothold in the world, when it was starting to kind of blossom into what it actually was going to become. What is American symphonic music? That was the question that was beginning to be answered in the 1890s, and Mr. Dvorak has a huge role to play in that. And what role is that, you say? I'm so glad you asked. Thanks for joining us tonight, by the way. We're so lucky enough to be co-hosting and co-doing this with our lovely sponsors, the Dorchester County Library. Woo woo! Can I get a holler with my co-host Elizabeth Neal here from the library? We're so lucky to be coming to you live via Facebook Live. Getting back to the presentation here, Dvorak and America. So he came over in 1892 to the U.S. He's from Bohemia. At that point, it was called Bohemia, not to be confused with Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Anyway, getting off on a tangent here. He came over to the United States to be the director of the racially mixed National Conservatory of Music in New York City. It was founded in 1885 by a wealthy New York City lady named Jeanette Thurber. And her goal was to create an American school of music. Her vision, her long-term plan was exactly that. Okay, so she hired, at that point, probably the most prominent and important composer who was known all around the world, specifically for his work with folk music. Dvorak was known back in Europe for his well, kind of music of the poor people, the music of the peasant class, the music of, the folk origins. His Slavonic dances were taken over the world. It's extremely fun and just such happy music. But he was one of the original kind of creators of this folk identity. In fact, 1 year after he came over to the US, he wrote a piece that we now know as the New World Symphony, which is the Symphony Number 9, originally titled Symphony Number 5, Symphony in E minor. One of his probably most famous works, I would say. Have you all heard that one? Do you know that one? Do you know Symphony Number 9? I would love to hear in the comments. Perhaps you will write and see what we have here. I was just told I need to speak slower. I apologize. Had a little caffeine earlier today. I do apologize, but thank you very much for my co-host for giving me that important tip. I'm going to enunciate a bit more, everyone. Deep breath. Deep breath. We're all in this together. I'm trying to get through this presentation because it's gloriously fun, and we only have an hour. I'm trying to get you all that information. You can rewind and fast forward. Anyway, we're getting off topic here. So, as I already mentioned, he wrote the New World Symphony in 1893, in the first half of that year. Ironically enough, around the same time, he was feeling kind of homesick. He was missing home. And ironically, the theme from the second movement, the very famous English horn solo from the New World Symphony, which was originally thought to be a native folk tune of the Americas, now it's not, was actually called Going Home. All right? And so a homesick Dvorak in the summer of 1893 took a vacation. He was offered a place in a Czech settlement in Spillville, Iowa. Yes, the blooming metropolis of Spillville, Iowa is where Dvorak found himself in 1893. What is little known is the fact that he passed up an offer to spend the summer in Charleston. He was invited to Charleston, and I don't have more details for you on that. I wish I did. Something tells me, though, that they saw how immensely important he was for developing a music scene. A music scene that we will see soon was kind of coming to life in our very own Charleston. We'll get to that in a second here. So, let's dive right in. Here's two more quotes from Mr. Dvorak from 1893, and I apologize, my picture cuts off his left ear there. We're pulling a Van Gogh tonight, but that's okay. I found that the music of the Negroes and of the Indians practically identical. The music of the two races bore a remarkable similarity to the music of Scotland. So what Dvorak is trying to tie in together is the similar kind of sonorities and sounds. Now it's accepted, most musicologists agree, that what he was referring to was the use of the pentatonic scale. Now, what is a pentatonic scale? I'm so glad you asked. It's basically penta, which is 5 tonic notes. 5 notes. And you know this. In fact, I'm going to go demonstrate. I'm going to be off camera for a second. That's okay. I'm going to demonstrate what a pentatonic scale is. All right, I'm coming back. Did you all miss me? I know you did. I'm back. That's the pentatonic scale, and so he was noticing that this music existed in Scotland, in the Czech Republic, and in the U.S. How did they don't know what? So that was pretty remarkable to him. He also noticed, in those melodies of America, I discovered that all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. Mind you, so he's trying to really build this idea up. You have everything you can possibly need right here. Use it. Now, we often know that Gershwin is kind of seen as like one of the first, I guess you could say, of the true American style of symphonic music. Rhapsody in Blue, American in Paris, really because of the fusion of jazz and everything else in them, we know them as such, right? But hang on a second, that's about 30 years in between there. Let's figure out how we got there, okay? Let's do that. So my question to all of you now, and I've asked my lovely friend Elizabeth to ask all of you, how do you think Charleston fits into all of this? All I said was that Dvorak was offered a chance to vacation in Charleston in 1893, but I haven't said much else. I also mentioned that Edmund Thornton Jenkins is from Charleston, so maybe I gave it away a little bit there. But I'm curious what you all think the role of Charleston has in all of this. Write your comments in that comment section. We'd love to hear from you. Sound off, hit that like button, subscribe button. Let us know you're here. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, do we have anything? Anyone? No? Not yet? Not yet. No responses yet. That's okay. That's okay. I myself am a slow typer as well, so that's okay. But in the interest of time, we have so much to get through tonight. We're gonna go ahead and see, maybe take a first step into how Charleston fits into all this, shall we? And here is a lovely picture, and I'm actually going to ask this question of you now. Do you think that this picture, I forgot to give you this one, sorry Liz. Do you think this picture that now appears on your screen is that of a European capital, big old European city, or do you think that this is Charleston? All I will tell you is that this is a painting from the 1700s, the 18th century, where there's a quote from Edmund Burke. He says, "Charleston approached more nearly the social refinement of a great European capital than any other American city." This is before the American Revolution. Charleston was really the crown jewel, if you will, of the British Empire here in the colonies. And so, do you think this picture here is that of a European city or Charleston before the Revolution? If you said Charleston, you are correct. This is absolutely a picture in Charleston. And I think that's pretty remarkable because when you look at it, you can't really tell. Is it kind of like a Parisian garden? Is it sort of like Versailles? In fact, if you go to Middleton Plantation today, you can see that same kind of European planned grid kind of garden style that is similar to Versailles. That's not a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, post-revolution, things got even boomier. At that point, Charleston was, I think, the second most populous city in the United States at that point, now the new United States, behind Philadelphia. European-style classical music was actually thriving, believe it or not, especially here in Charleston. In 1819, the first 30-person orchestra was formed in Charleston. Did you know that? I didn't. In 1819, what was also established was something called the Cycling Music House, or Cycling, I guess you could say. It was on King Street, and it was founded as a retail music store, and my face has cut off the presentation. That is just terrible. What can I do about this? I'm going to try to move my face. Can I move my face? There we go. Oh, yeah. I'm going to cut myself off. That's okay. That's all right. Oh, there we go. All-time high. There you go. I'll tell you what else it was. It was also a publishing house for local composers. This is pretty important. I want to set you up with the idea that Charleston was a very important musical city, okay? And also pre-Civil War, this was one of the places to be. Pre-Revolutionary War, this was definitely the place to be. All right, but then that all sort of changed, and the Civil War played a nasty role in that. South Carolina was a city of, Charleston rather, was a city of many firsts. We were the first to attack a Union fort here, as we all know. It led to a Northern Union victory. One of the things that kind of gave Charleston its economic foundation was plantations and agriculture. Most of those destroyed during the war. So really the economy of Charleston and South Carolina was sort of in shambles afterwards. It was not a good time. Reconstruction was not a pretty time to be around in these here parts. Ironically, there is a archival document in the South Carolina archives that talks about a Charleston Conservatory that was founded in 1884. Now, why is that kind of interesting? Because I just mentioned before that in 1885, there was that conservatory that was founded in New York City that Mr. Dvorak came to be the director of. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? 1 year prior to. I think that's pretty important. Now, 7 years after that, we have a pretty important Charleston milestone. Those of you that know the history of Charleston have probably heard of the Jenkins Orphanage. And that, my dear friends, is where this takes us next. I'm very excited to share with you, if you haven't ever heard of the Jenkins Orphanage, I'm going to put myself off the screen because we need to see this here slide. Don't worry, Liz, I'll get myself back on there in a second. But it's good to see these words here. In 1891, there was a mass, like a huge amount of peasant black labor with few land rights and really no opportunity of emigration out of South Carolina. At this point, a lot of people were trying to leave the state. It was not a good place to be, like I already mentioned. There was no real opportunity. There was just it's a weird kind of catch-22. You're kind of stuck here, with nothing to do. And this led to a lot of poverty, a lot of despair, a lot of homelessness. And luckily for us, there was a man by the name of Daniel Jenkins. He was actually born into slavery in South Carolina. And I think it's not clear which county exactly, but what we do know is that he moved in his early life to Arkansas. He then moved back with his wife, and I believe he had a few kids at that point. He moved back to what is now Ladson, South Carolina, and opened up a timber business. Timber, like the song. No? Anyone? Timber? Okay. That's my bad joke for the night. One of two or three. That's right. That's the same one. I'm yelling timber. Thank you, Jenkins. So he came back and started this very, very successful business. He was a very smart man, very resolute man. What he did notice is that as he was becoming more and more successful, he would start noticing that people were not doing okay on the streets of Charleston. There was more people that were homeless he was coming across, and he wanted to help everyone he could, but the money in your pocket only goes so far, and he was noticing he can really only help about 5 to 6 people. Well, in 1892, he started this thing called the Orphan Aid Society. At this point, he was a successful businessman with many connections in the city. In fact, the mayor of Charleston at that time sat on his advisory board for the Orphan Aid Society. He was a very well-connected man. It was the only black orphanage in South Carolina, and by late 1892, he had over 100 orphans under his care. That's incredible. In a few months, over 100 kids came in through the doors. And so he soon realized the same issue he had trying to help people out of his own pocket. Wow, how are we going to pay for all this? And so he started realizing something that was very popular with the Tuskegee Singers. And inspired by Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Singers, I believe there's also the Fisk Institute Singers, if memory serves, where these little groups of kids would go around and perform, and they'd raise funds for the school. And Jenkins thought, that's not a bad idea. Why don't I start a band? Let's get that band back together, huh? Or in this case, get it started. So what he did is he put out a request to Charleston residents for old, battered instruments, and he got them. He also received from the Citadel old uniforms that were kind of old, ancient, discarded. And if you look at this picture here, this is one of the early pictures of the Jenkins Orphanage Band. You can see exactly that. Those old, rickety instruments and those discarded uniforms. But it gave them a really cool, unique look, doesn't it? In fact, you can see just how tattered these instruments are. If you look at the tuba player here, I think it's on the right side? No, the left side of your screen. That's my left hand. I guess the left side of your screen. Maybe it's the right. I don't know. It's the right. Okay, whatever. Mirror images. It is, yeah. A little euphonium there. You can just see the rim should be going all the way across, but it has that big old dent in it. You can see just how battered these things are. Doesn't matter. These kids learned so quickly. They learned from 2 local musicians who Daniel Jenkins hired to teach them initially, and they were playing hours a day. If they weren't in school, they were playing music. And if they weren't like in the school year, they were really playing music. By late 1893, so like a year and a half since the creation of the school, they were already being sent to other places other than Charleston to play on street corners, what they called pass the hat performances. What is that, you may ask? Have you ever seen a street performer? You ever been to Vegas or New York and seen a street performer and then they pass the hat around for donations? They did that. And they were very successful with it. And these kids would play so much. In fact, if you were wondering what this sounded and looked like, luckily for us, we have one of these early performances captured on film. This is archival footage that I believe is now with the South Carolina Department of Archives, if memory serves. But luckily for us, we have footage of this, and that is the wrong window. Here is an early performance of the Jenkins Orphanage Band. I think we get the idea there. Pretty remarkable. I'm actually curious. I want to ask another question. Sorry, I forgot another one of those. Another question to ask our dear audience. What does that music sound like to you? What does that remind you of? I'm curious. I did this presentation, a hybrid version of this a few weeks ago, and I got some interesting answers from the crowd. I'm actually wondering what you all think that sounds like to you. Cue the Jeopardy music, please, because we got to give this one a second. But while you're writing your responses, I'm going to tell you that notice what was important there. There was a call and response. There was two little kids that were leading the band, and they were dancing. They were kind of conducting, and they were getting the crowd engaged. And that was one of the highlights of this. Eventually, as this group got better and bigger, they realized they can simply replace the teachers they had with the oldest kids in the orphanage. The oldest kids in the orphanage would then take over and lead these tours. They would conduct the ensemble. They would stand in front of that group and also teach the youngest ones. So this tradition would carry over from generation to generation in the Jenkins Orphanage. And that's pretty important for us. Why? Because a lot of cool music traditions were deeply embedded in that. Do we have any responses on what people think it sounds like yet? Not yet. Well, I can't wait all day, everyone. Can I? No, I can't. I sure can't. I'll tell you what that sounds like. In my previous presentation, the first comment I got was, it sounds like a college fight song, like a college band. And I was like, yes, it does. It sounds like a marching band, doesn't it? And that's because what they originally did was they took these old kind of military marches, kind of Sousa marches. And if you notice the instrumentation, both in the video and in the picture, it's primarily brass and percussion. What was at that time called the brass band. In fact, they still have things called brass bands. Well, that's exactly what that kind of originated from. But not only the Sousa March, they then took that and added their own traditions into it, their own music, native South Carolina music that comes to us from a lot of different sources. A lot of it passed down, of course, from slave culture and indigenous music cultures there. Gullah Geechee culture was a huge influence there as well, and other native kind of sources all meshed together. So these kids, whether they knew it or not, had a lot of music deeply embedded in them that they then morphed with these Sousa marches. You can kind of see where that's going, can't you? This dance style music that has a lot of cool rhythms and kind of folk melodies. You can kind of tell where that's going. If you can't yet, you will in a second. So the Jenkins Orphanage Band was growing. I told you in a few months they had over 100 kids. Well, in a year they had 360 children at the orphanage. And then one more year later, nearly 500. That's a lot of kids. All right. I can't even imagine having one, let alone 500. But anyway, so what this means is they have a lot of ensembles that can tour. They have a lot of opportunities to kind of increase their funding. And therefore their tours grew as well. And so, you'd see these Jenkins Orphanage band groups pop up all over the East Coast. More and more and more. And one year, eventually, they get over across the sea and go to London. In 1895, the band went to London to gather support and funds in England. In fact, there's actually a great quote there, and I'm not going to get too bogged down with the story, but there's a story of Pastor Jenkins being there with these boys, and they were playing on the street. And Pastor Jenkins at that point, gets arrested. Why, you may say? Child labor laws were a little different in London than they were in the US at that point. So he was arrested for that. Luckily for him, coincidentally, I think this is an amazing story. Someone heard that band play. One of his former advisory board members that helped him start that heard the original Jenkins group play, was now a successful lawyer in London. Heard that unmistakable sound, as she called it herself, the unmistakable sound and strains of that sound, and came to his help. Needless to say, everything was fine. Big old misunderstanding. Pastor Jenkins eventually got back over to the States. Everyone's happy. Yes, Elizabeth?
Larry said that music earlier sounds like early cartoons.
Early cartoon. I love that. That's actually very good. I have not heard that one. It really does, doesn't it? It really does. Ooh, I wonder if I can tie that in somehow later. Maybe. Thank you, Larry, for that comment. Very much. Thank you. Let's. I wonder if I can tie that in. I might just be able to. We'll see. We'll see. Okay, so a few years down the road, this thing is getting even better and bigger. So in 1904, they had their own stage at the St. Louis World's Fair. In 1905, they were invited to play for President Roosevelt's inauguration. And speaking of, happy Inauguration Day, everyone. In 1909, they were invited to play for President Taft's inauguration. So this group got to be pretty famous. Their sound began to be pretty unmistakable and pretty recognizable. In fact, in 1914, they were invited back to London to play at the Anglo-American Exposition, an exposition in which the biggest advances in technology, art, and culture would be on display. And the Jenkins Orphanage Band went as one of the proponents of what is developing and new in American culture. I want you to think about that for a second. What's happening in the world right around 1914 besides World War I? But culturally speaking, what are we about to embark on? The Jazz Age, right? And needless to say, I have a feeling this Jenkins Orphanage sound had a lot to do with it. Well, actually, let me go back. I'm sorry. Do you see in this photo? No, you don't, because my face is covering him again. You see here in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a fellow here with a clarinet, standing, looking off to the side, looking all regal in his dapper new white uniform. You see that little clarinet is there? No, it's not Wojciech Milewski playing the clarinet. That is a young Edmund Thornton Jenkins. And who, you might ask, is Edmund Thornton Jenkins? If you have photographic memory, you would have already seen the next slide. But he was the 7th son of Pastor Jenkins, one of 11 total children. It's a lot of kids. 11 kids. I don't know anyone that has 11 kids. Do you know anyone that has 11 kids? Okay, very quiet over here. So he was the 7th son, born here in Charleston, South Carolina. And he was one of the most skilled musicians in the orphanage. Probably, you can imagine, grew up just hours and hours and hours a day, deeply embedded in this musical culture. He began to excel at every instrument he picked up, and that's in fact one of his what he was known for in his early years. Anything he picked up, he could master. Well, the things he did best were clarinet, piano, and violin. Take away the violin, and him and I have a lot in common. No, I'm just kidding. He was way better than I am. So he was at a young age, even an incredibly skilled musician. And by the time he attended Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1908, his biggest influences were Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Antonin Dvorak, Will Marion Cook, Jim Europe, and more. But I want to highlight Dvorak because why didn't we kick this whole presentation off with a Dvorak quote or two or three? And him talking about how native folk music of the Americas is going to be the foundation of our American symphonic tradition? Well, Mr. Will Marion Cook, who would later lead the Southern Syncopated Orchestra, was a student of Dvorak. And these were Jenkins' major influences. Coincidences? Perhaps not. All right, let's go ahead. So when he was in college, he would lead these tours of the Jenkins Orphanage Band. In 1914, he traveled with the band to London for that exposition that I just mentioned. And it was there that he met a lot of important folks that got him enrolled in the Royal Academy of Music, one of the most prestigious schools of music then and now. Nothing's really changed. And he enrolled to study composition and clarinet. In fact, he would be pretty dang good at both of them. There's a few quotes here, and of course I'm blocking things again. There's a few quotes here. He showed a lot of promise and growth. By June of that year, 1916, he had won an orchestral scholarship to play the clarinet and composed an overture that was well received. So, I mean, the kid's got a lot of talent. In 1919, remember that name, Will Marion Cook? Well, he was one of his good friends by that point. And he invited his Southern Syncopated Orchestra to come to London in July. And it brought with them a brand new dance and jazz craze to Britain. The Southern Syncopated Orchestra at that point played kind of early hybrids of like this sort of very early symphonic jazz style, but it was really more like a jazz band instrumentation. If you've heard of the Paul Whiteman Orchestra that premiered the Rhapsody in Blue, imagine like one step before that. This is sort of that kind of group. And in fact, on that tour, Will offered Edmund the leadership position of the SSO, which Edmund turned down. But I want you to think about that for a second. That means that Edmund had a massively deep knowledge of the jazz and dance tradition at this point, right? A lot of that probably, no doubt, thanks to the Jenkins Orphanage Band and the native music of Charleston. Okay, well, later that year, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, because of that tour, Edmund writes a piece called Folk Rhapsody. This piece has changed titles, as we'll see on the next slide, but originally the title was called Folk Rhapsody. It was premiered on a concert that featured predominantly the works of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a huge influence for black composers at the time. He was, in fact, one of the only big names back then. He was a British composer, huge influence. So they wanted to dedicate a concert to him. And in light of that, Jenkins wrote a piece that he called Folk Rhapsody. He wanted to call it something else, and later the original title will actually come through. In fact, he called it Charlestonia. Charlestonia, a folk rhapsody. And what, pray tell, does this Charlestonia sound like? I'm so glad... too fast. I'm so glad you asked, because I'm going to play you the opening, let's say, minute and a half of Charlestonia, a folk rhapsody. And I want you to pay attention to the instruments and the melodies. And I'm playing this from my iTunes. I own this recording to avoid any copyright issues. Clarinet's pretty prominent there. Wasn't Jenkins a really good clarinetist? An English horn. Didn't Dvorak have an important English horn solo? Interesting. An English lament style English horn solo. Oh, clarinet again. Ooh. What? Let's stop it right there. That's the first minute and a half of Charlestonia. Did that sound at all familiar to you? Interesting. Massive kind of glissando on a trilled low note. Hopefully by now it's clear what the connection is to Rhapsody in Blue. But we'll take it one step further, even more. Don't you worry. We got time for that. We got time. But one thing I want to point out, the similarities to Dvorak's own music. Did you hear the English horn solo in there? How much does that remind you of New World Symphony? And also that theme, the French horn, the oboe, and the clarinet all played, was actually a spiritual, Brother, Where Art Thou, that Jenkins heard in his youth at the Charleston docks. Now, he would later say that he didn't remember the name of it, but he just remembered it from his childhood. Naturally, this would be because he heard it all over town, whether it's at the market or at the docks, who knows where, but he heard it all over in his youth, and it became one of the fundamental themes of his music. Hey, remember that quote Dvorak had, that all the music that you already need to make American symphonic music was already here? Was already there? Yeah. So here we go. Jenkins is already kind of doing that, isn't he? A little bit. Charleston's son. Proud of him. Proud of him. Here we go. This this question is pretty redundant. Does anything that in that piece sound familiar to you? I kind of gave away that answer. So we're going to go ahead and skip that slide, shall we? Why not? Sure. So Charlestonia, as it was later called. Well, you may know who Alan Locke is. He was the unofficial sort of intellectual head of the Harlem Renaissance. which was, of course, in its boom from 1918 to 1930ish, right around the same time as the Jazz Age. No coincidence there. And he would later write, after seeing a 1925 performance of Charlestonia, he wrote of his piece, Jenkins had broken with the romantic school of music centered on Dvorak and had joined the realistic school of music, writing a black music based on folk jazz. That's interesting. Mind you, Jenkins was in New York at the height of the Harlem Renaissance in the early 1920s, and he was looking to advance the cause of the art form, just trying to get his own orchestra to tour. Would come up with a lot of resistance, but hang on a second. Wasn't Gershwin in New York in the 1920s? It's well known and well established that Gershwin was a frequent kind of visitor to Harlem at that time. He would hang out with most of the musicians in the Harlem Renaissance. In fact, we're going to see even more connections there. But what do you think are the odds? I don't have the answer to this, but what do you think are the odds that Jenkins and Gershwin ran into each other there? I'd love to know. Oh, I wish I could know. But mind you, there are some great sources that I tapped into for this presentation. One of them is here with me. This is my own personal copy of the Jeffrey Green book, Edmund, Thornton, Jenkins, The Life and Times of an American Black Composer. But if you want your own copy, all you got to do is go down to the Somerville branch of the Dorchester County Library, because they've got a copy. There you go. All right. There you go. Shameless plug time. But I mentioned before the title of this Rhapsody changed over the years. Folk Rhapsody #1 is how it was released in 1919. Later it was called Charlestonian, a folk rhapsody, probably because of the themes that he heard in his youth. Also the clarinet playing. Something tells me that was a little bit of Jenkins' own youthful clarinet playing in there. And other names, etc. Today we know it as Charlestonian. But why did he call it Folk Rhapsody #1 initially? And maybe it was to avoid confusion with a dance that was taking over the nation. You ever heard of the Charleston? I'm sure you have. James P. Johnson's The Charleston. Well, let's listen to an early version of this, shall we? Because there is a pretty cool original version of the Charleston. That's not the right one. There you go. Here's an early Charleston. Oh, you see that move there? Pretty cool video, I would say. I love that because you can hear the similarity to the music from the first Jenkins Orphanage Band video I showed you. Same group, obviously, if you didn't recognize the Citadel uniforms or the music, same group. But what was different about this one was the little boy dancing in front this time. Did you notice some of those dance moves? The cross legs move and the flailing leg there behind him? Doesn't that remind you of the early Charleston? Interesting. Shall we dive ahead? We shall dive ahead. James P. Johnson's The Charleston. So this first appeared in the 1923 Broadway musical Runnin' Wild. And I'm putting myself off screen again so you can see everything here. I apologize, everyone. I apologize. So it was inspired by Charleston native U.B. Blake's 1921 Charleston Rag from a different Broadway musical, Shuffle Along. Mind you, these guys were in New York during the height of the Harlem Renaissance as well. Just point that out there. And where did U.B. Blake get his Charleston Rag from? He said it was from observing Charlestonians and the Jenkins Orphanage Band musicians in Charleston dancing and playing Geechee movements, Gullah and Geechee movements. The music, he said, was an evolution of marches, ragtime, and traditional Gullah Geechee music, and so was the dance step. In fact, a lot of dance historians have traced the similarity of the Charleston to similar steps seen in Haiti, Cape Verde, and Ashanti tribes in Africa. That makes sense, given the fact that people coming over would probably bring those traditions with them, and then they'd evolve in some sort of natural way. Yeah, that makes sense. So, the homage to the Charleston development of jazz is pretty alive and well in that very famous dance step. And don't worry, I got you covered. You want to hear the actual Charleston that you all know? I got you covered. Let's take a listen to James P. Johnson's The Charleston. Only 30 seconds though. Only 30 seconds. Was that 29? Okay. We're not going to get to the actual known part. Okay, I'm going to stop it at the 29-second mark because otherwise I'll get flagged for copyright infringement apparently. But mind you, I'm not ever intending to do so, of course. It's never the intention here.
Fair use.
I'm sorry, fair use. That's right. Yeah, we're just trying to educate, right? I was trying to get to that very famous part of the Charleston. Perhaps if I go back into my presentation for a second. Did y'all recognize that one? No, if you didn't, don't worry. Let's keep playing a little bit of it. Recognize that? Yeah, we all know and love that. That's a phenomenal piece of music, great dance tune. The Charleston and James P. Johnson, who was not a Charlestonian, but he hung out with pretty much everyone in Harlem that was. U.B. Blake, oh my gosh, what are the other names? I don't remember the other names, but there's many other composers that were in New York that were from Charleston at the time. Amazingly cool scene. I wish I could have been there. Let's carry on, shall we? So, there we go. Am I in the right one? I am. So this fusion of styles, let's briefly break down this. I have a quote here from Jack McRae, who wrote a book called Charleston Jazz. He says, "It may boil down to the simple notion that we have known more about New Orleans jazz origination and that those beginnings have been trumpeted more loudly than any of the other many birthplaces of American improvisational music. Charleston is one of those cradles, a very important one." I would agree. I think we've hopefully shown a little bit of that by now. And from the South Carolina Encyclopedia, at the turn of the 20th century, classical music was melding with indigenous influences, initiating the shift to a distinctly American style of music and the emergence of native composers such as George Gershwin. Now they cite George Gershwin because he's sort of like the first household name you associate with American symphonic style, probably because of his Tin Pan Alley days, the popularity of a lot of his music and his actual songs. There's a lot of factors there, but George Gershwin's an interesting name to bring up because he and Charleston have a lot in common, whether he knows it or not. And too bad we can't ask him and we won't ever know. He lived a life too short, just like did Edmund Thornton. But there's a quote here from Gilbert Chase in his book America's Music. All of these sources, by the way, will be at the end in my further reading slide. If you have any interest in finding out more about these sources, I will have all of those titles and even call numbers in the Dorchester County Library in the SC Lens system. Yes. But anyway, carrying on here. Composer George Gershwin's contribution to the American scene is significant beyond his music itself, in that he was able to reconcile 2 points of view and achieve popular music in large traditional forms. The 2 points of view, you mean popular and classical. Well, hang on a second. Didn't Edmund Thornton Jenkins just do that? Interesting. 1919 was the folk Rhapsody. 1924 was Rhapsody in Blue. And just in case you forgot the opening to Rhapsody in Blue, here you go. Now, that opening clarinet glissando is famous these days. Everyone that plays it a different way. They got to put their own little spin and improvisatory style onto it. The original creator of that glissando was a virtuoso jazz clarinetist named Ross Gorman. Now, there's a famous story that all that Gershwin wrote on paper. In fact, I have the score for Rhapsody in Blue here right in front of me. It just so happens I have it. I don't know. It happens to be here. So I want to just actually show you what's on paper here. And all you see there is clarinet, right? And all it has is trill note, F, and then a run up to a B flat. It's just a scale. Pretty much a scale. Well, that was pretty straight edge at the time, right? You know, it's just a scale up to a B flat. It's kind of dull and boring, right? And mind you, the premiere of this took place with the Paul Whiteman Jazz Orchestra. And so virtuoso clarinetist Ross Gorman was actually there. Now, can you imagine at the time, that we're talking 1924, these roots of jazz, whether it's New Orleans, Kansas City, Charleston, would have all found their way to New York by then. Is it really that far a stretch to assume that Ross Gorman was familiar with these early kind of Charlestonian sounding riffs and motives and things like that? And here's a rhetorical question. I'm actually curious. I'd actually love to poll the audience if we could. I'm actually very curious. Do you think Gorman had ever crossed paths with Jenkins in New York? Do you think he'd ever heard the folk rhapsody that he wrote? I'm wondering because the two clarinet riffs in the pieces sound so similar. Obviously, we know where Jenkins' clarinet motive came from. We know it came from his roots, from his childhood, from the Jenkins Orphanage, Gullah Geechee traditions, you name it, spirituals. It's embedded in his soul. Is it therefore a far stretch to assume that Gorman would have been familiar with that and he was trying to imitate it? There's, of course, the famous story I began to allude to that Gershwin, heard Gorman completely change that little simple scale and do something improvisatory with it, and Gershwin fell in love with it. As if oh my God, that's exactly what I've been going for. How did you know that? That's absolutely what I want. What we don't know about that story is perhaps the missing piece. Why Gershwin loved it so much. I'll remind you that Gershwin was at the time working in New York, and he had been his entire life. And he was a big proponent of the Harlem Renaissance. Well, he knew James P. Johnson. He knew U.B. Blake. He worked with these guys. Could he have met Jenkins in New York at one point? Maybe. But he was very familiar with Charleston music at the time. Only a few years later, he would write a second sort of piano concerto that heavily featured specific rhythms in it. Is it a far stretch to assume that Gershwin had a massive knowledge of Charleston music without even recognizing it or realizing it? Perhaps. But I want to come back to Gorman for a second because, as you all know, there's always something fun and different in one of my videos. And you betcha, we're going to have another one here. I mentioned Ross Gorman. What is little known about him is that he's actually also like a goofball and total like prankster and jokester. So part of the reason that clarinet gliss that he played may have been successful is because he was just totally goofing off in rehearsal. Man, if you're not convinced, I'm going to play you about halfway through here. This is a song of his. It's from a group of his called the Novelty Syncopators. And I kid you not, the name of this piece is called Barkin' Dog. Let's start it at around 120. Here we go. Anyway.
What instruments were those?
Interesting. Very good question, Elizabeth. That's a very good question. So I'll tell you what those instruments were. Clarinet was one of them. As you can tell, the first one to play was the clarinet. And afterwards, I believe there was a trombone. Let's hear that again from the 120 mark. That is a clarinet. Also a clarinet. That is a trombone. Great questions. Great questions. So you can tell these guys were jokesters and pranksters. They had a good time. Is it a far stretch to say that Gorman was just goofing off in rehearsals and he saw this massive scale and he's like, dude, I got to do something with this. Like, it ain't going to be no boring scale if I'm playing it. Absolutely. But could he have been subconsciously influenced by his own training and roots and the things he was hearing in New York at the time? Mind you, the Paul Whiteman Orchestra was the premier jazz ensemble in New York at the time. Could it be that they were familiar with this Charlestonian sound, the Jenkins sound, if you will? I don't know. But as we all know, that's really hard to see, isn't it? I apologize. The white text on a white background. I don't know what I was thinking there. I don't know. But hopefully you can all read this. In case you can't, we all know the Porgy and Bess connection of Gershwin to Charleston. We all know that he wrote the Dubose Hayward novel in 1920. He read the novel in 1926. It was released in 25. He saw the play in 29. And this is an important little side note because the Jenkins Orphanage Band featured prominently not only in the novel, but they also played in person for the entire duration of the Broadway run of Porgy and Bess, the play. So Gershwin must have known that this group existed and heard them, and it was like alarm bells, like should be going off right now, like how connected Gershwin and Charleston are. But he then proposed in 33 the collaboration to Hayward about doing Porgy and Bess as an opera. In 34, Gershwin visited South Carolina. And this is a little aside, and I thought about cutting this slide, and I'm glad I didn't because this really ties into Dvorak. You remember in 1893, he was offered a visit to South Carolina, and he didn't take it? Well, 1934, Gershwin did. And luckily for us, he stayed at Folly Beach. He attended a lot of different services, gala services, lived in their culture. He took note of Charleston street markets, their music, the cries that they would have, these like kind of old, kind of like these melodic inflected like sounds. And he put them all into Porgy and Bess, which we now know as one of the first true American operas, what we now call a folk opera. Well, perhaps the true American style of music is folk-based, and perhaps it's started with the folk rhapsodies. And maybe that, just maybe, the earliest music is the American Rhapsody. And the Rhapsody, but wait a minute, which Rhapsody? Is it the Edmund Thornton Jenkins folk Rhapsody or George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue? This is a fun question. Now that I've blown your minds, hopefully a little bit with this presentation tonight, I'm curious. Did this change your opinion at all? I mentioned that Rhapsody in Blue's original title was The American Rhapsody. Well, was it actually? Or was Edmund Thornton Jenkins' folk Rhapsody the first true American Rhapsody? I'm curious. Write it in the comments. Do we have anyone? No, not yet. That's okay. While you write your comments, I want to play you a little bit more of Charlestonia. In fact, I'm going to compare the two. I'm going to play you the opening riff from Rhapsody in Blue again, and then I'm going to play a little bit of the folk Rhapsody. You make up your own mind. And now, Charlestonia. It's a fun little debate. It's a fun question to ask. I don't even know if we need an answer. Let's just say that both of them are incredible pieces and both deserve to be played way more often than they already are. Well, maybe not Rhapsody in Blue. It's already done enough. But suffice it to say, both of these composers grew up around the exact same time. They were influenced by very similar musical ideas. They both would have known about Dvorak and his music and his influence, what he wanted to embed onto the music scene in America. But they also both grew up in a very rich and diverse musical background, one in Charleston, one in New York. However, they both grew up around jazz. They both grew up around dance. They both grew up around popular music. Gershwin, it was Tin Pan Alley and these early kind of Irving Berlin style songs. And for Jenkins, it was the native music of Charleston, not as publicized. We are now getting more and more information thanks to the Charleston Jazz Initiative about the roots of Charleston jazz, thankfully for us, and Jack McRae's book is fantastic. I highly encourage you to go check it out. But suffice it to say that maybe we were just lucky to have two composers who had very similar styles and influences that were luckily writing American-style music at the exact same time. Now, they both lived very short lives, and unfortunately for us, Jenkins spent the majority of his adult life outside of the US. Perhaps that's why his name is not more familiar to many ears. But it's time to change that. It should be. His music is fantastic. As you can see, he's a talented composer rooted in this kind of European but also native tradition. He's truly a cosmopolitan American sound. We should be singing his name a lot more, shouldn't we? So, without further ado, I promised you a further reading list here, and there it all is. If you are interested in getting more information, that was my dog snoring, by the way, in case that made it into the audio for this video. In case you want more information, these are the call numbers, but I can send this to anyone who would like more information. I have one of these sources here with me, my own very private book. But these are all in the SC Lens system, and two of them specifically are in the Somerville branch. So I must have misspoken earlier. This one is not in the Somerville branch. Sad face. But the other ones are the History of Jazz and the Charleston Jazz book. So go visit your library, support your library, support your orchestra as well. Thank you so much for being here. If you are here, you are supporting both of these fantastic organizations. I want to thank you on behalf of my co-host and co-sponsor, the library, and Miss Elizabeth Neal. I am your host, Wojciech Milewski, music director of the Somerville Orchestra. I want to thank you so much, so much for joining us for tonight's presentation. Hope you had a great time. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed yourself. And we'll see you next time. And when is next time? That's February 17th at 6 p.m. right here again, Facebook Live, with a presentation we call It's Baroquin. It's Baroquin. All right?
That's terrible.
It is. It is. Orchestral music is outdated, you say. Not so fast. Come see how similar Maroon 5 and Johann Pachelbel are. Learn all about a genre called Baroque pop. That exists, by the way. And even hear some medieval-style covers of today's pop music. You're in for a treat. We're going to have a lot of fun. I promise you, we always do. Today, it was all about barking dogs and clarinets. Next time, who knows what it'll be. I don't know. I never know. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. It's been a privilege. And do we have any other further comments or questions before I sign this thing off? And of course, no, come on, write your comments next time. Invite your friends, get your family down here for this one. It's fun for the whole family, as you can see. I even have bad dad jokes, so all the dads should be here as well. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Take care, Somerville.